Prince Andrew was totally different. He could fly off the handle at the smallest thing. He would be abusive. He would shout. He would swear. So we had a particular issue with Prince Andrew.
Whispers once confined to private corridors have finally burst into the open, dragging decades of carefully hidden chaos into the light. At exclusive parties where royalty mixed with the elite, witnesses say Prince Andrew's behavior wasn't just inappropriate, it was shocking, relentless, and embarrassing even to those who tried to defend him. From unsettling demands to moments that left entire rooms stunned, his long trail of misconduct is now impossible to bury. But what really happened at those parties? And why are insiders breaking their silence after all these years? The prince who never learned the word no. It began, as so many stories about him do, with something that looked harmless at first glance. 72 teddy bears were placed with military precision across Prince Andrew's bed deep inside Buckingham Palace. Anyone else might have laughed at the sight, but the staff didn't. They had been given a laminated photograph showing the exact order, angle, and position each teddy bear must occupy. If even one was slightly out of place, the quiet corridors would fill with his angry shouts. Servants learned to follow the pattern word for word, as though the bears were ceremonial guards rather than childhood relics. It was a glimpse into a mind that demanded the world bend to its own comfort. But this behavior didn't appear overnight. It had been forming for years, long before adulthood granted Prince Andrew titles and privileges. Around the late 1970s, when he was still a teenager, whispers began to circulate among those who encountered him. One writer described a strange night at a country house party. Several young women asleep in their room, the house quiet and dark, when suddenly the door swung open at 2 in the morning. There stood Prince Andrew, claiming a ghost had frightened him and insisting he needed to share their bed. They threw him out instantly. It was a foolish, intrusive act, but also a revealing one. Even at 17, Prince Andrew moved through the world as if everyone else would simply accept whatever he wanted. A similar memory surfaced from another gathering, this time during a quiet morning routine. A young woman, barely awake, stood brushing her teeth in her ensuite bathroom when Prince Andrew strolled straight in without a knock. Instead of apologizing, he offered her an impromptu lecture on proper brushing technique, as though barging into a private space gave him authority to correct her. The moment was not endearing or quirky. It was unsettling, a reminder that boundaries mattered only when they were his. These stories drifted through the years like scattered warnings, small signs of a larger pattern that would grow stronger with age. Those who encountered Prince Andrew repeatedly said the same thing. He behaved as though women existed to entertain him, to react to him, to fit into his world without objection. His humor often came wrapped in thin disrespect, his attention in demands, his presence in entitlement. What makes these accounts linger is not just the actions themselves, but the environment that allowed them to continue. Within the royal walls, Prince Andrew's eccentricities were tolerated, even accommodated. Staff learned to tiptoe around irritation. Friends learned to roll their eyes and move on. The outside world rarely heard a whisper, and so the habits flourished in the shadows of palaces, private estates, and social circles more willing to shrug than confront. By the time Prince Andrew became an adult public figure, the signs were no longer subtle. His treatment of women in particular seemed guided by a single assumption. His feelings came first. If something amused him, everyone else was expected to play along. If something displeased him, the atmosphere changed instantly. Some remembered sudden mood swings over trivial matters, like a misplaced object or a poorly timed comment. Others recalled moments when Prince Andrew behaved as though every room he entered became his stage, and everyone inside it became an audience. The teddy bears, oddly enough, became one of the clearest symbols of that lifelong mindset. They were arranged not out of sentimentality, but control. The laminated card stored in the bedroom drawer wasn't protection for precious childhood memories. It was an instruction manual for obedience. Staff had to follow it because Prince Andrew expected the world to mirror his preferences exactly. What ties these events together isn't the strangeness of each moment, but the consistency behind them. The boy who entered girls' bedrooms uninvited became the man who demanded his toys be arranged like ceremonial relics. The teenager who lectured a stranger in her own bathroom grew into the adult who erupted when things didn't look the way he wanted. Decade after decade, the pattern repeated. Boundaries were suggestions, not rules. The settings changed. Country estates, royal residences, private suites, but Prince Andrew's behavior remained the same. And as time went on, those early stories, once seen as harmless anecdotes, started to look more like signposts pointing toward a larger truth. They revealed a man shaped not by responsibility, but by the steady reinforcement of privilege, someone who mistook indulgence for affection and entitlement for authority. The image of the 72 teddy bears remains more than a quirky detail. It is a quiet, unsettling reminder of a life lived inside a bubble where no one ever said no, and where the simplest objects became symbols of a deeper, long-standing pattern, one built on intrusion, expectation, and a belief that the world must always rearrange itself to Prince Andrew's liking. So if the world always bent to Prince Andrew's will, what hidden truths did those closest to the monarchy witness about his untouchable, domineering ways? Shadows behind the palace walls. Long before rumors hardened into stories, there was already a quiet understanding among those who worked closest to the monarchy. Prince Andrew moved through the world differently, not simply because he was born into privilege, but because he carried himself as though that privilege gave him license to unsettle, embarrass, or dominate anyone who crossed his path. His status as the Queen's favored son shaped the atmosphere around him, creating a silence that followed him into every room, every corridor, every gathering. Those who served in royal households recalled the tension that rose whenever Prince Andrew's footsteps echoed down a hallway. Even in the late 1990s, during weekends at country estates scattered across England, staff whispered warnings to one another, not because they feared mistakes — mistakes happen in any workplace — but because Prince Andrew often reacted as if errors were personal insults. A napkin folded slightly off-center, or a tray delivered a minute too late could trigger a storm of anger directed at young staff barely old enough to have left school. What unsettled many was not just the shouting, but the unpredictability. One moment, Prince Andrew might stroll through a drawing room with forced charm. The next, he might turn a harmless interaction into a humiliating spectacle. Former guests and household workers speak about these moments with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. They say his antics were not the playful mischief of a man trying to lighten a stiff royal atmosphere. They were deliberate shows of power. At social gatherings, especially those held in grand country homes between 1995 and 2002, Prince Andrew was known to burst into rooms uninvited, often late at night. Some guests initially assumed it was harmless curiosity, a misguided attempt to mingle, but the pattern soon became clear. Prince Andrew would swing open doors without knocking, scanning the room as though searching for something or someone. One woman recalled the uncomfortable moment when Prince Andrew paused in her doorway, assessed her like an item on display, and remarked that he was shopping for entertainment. His tone made it clear he expected no objections. Stories of Prince Andrew's so-called jokes circulated quietly among those who spent time around him. One such incident occurred during a private gathering where guests enjoyed a formal dinner. A young woman happened to be carrying a plate of pâté when Prince Andrew made an exaggerated show of sniffing the air. He declared, loudly enough for the room to hear, that it smelled awful. When the woman leaned down to inspect it, Prince Andrew shoved her face toward the plate, laughing as though he had performed some grand act of comedy. The room fell silent, but the silence wasn't confusion. It was fear of what would happen if anyone challenged him. He seemed to enjoy these moments of discomfort. At another house party, a woman awoke to find Prince Andrew pointing a fire extinguisher directly at her face. Witnesses say Prince Andrew blasted rooms with it throughout the night, leaving a trail of chaos and shrieking guests in his wake. He treated the fear he caused as amusement, lingering in doorways to watch reactions before moving on to the next target. Younger staff members, particularly teenage maids brought in from small towns to work in historic residences, often bore the brunt of Prince Andrew's temper. Some were just 18, far from home and dependent on their income. Prince Andrew appeared to understand this and used it. A glass polished imperfectly, or a request not completed at impossible speed, became an excuse for him to unleash his authority. His voice, sharp and commanding, would ring through the hallway as he dressed them down for errors too minor to justify the cruelty. During weekend gatherings, Prince Andrew introduced games that were meant to seem light-hearted, but left many feeling cornered. Guests remember being forced into long chains, marching through ornate rooms like a children's parade. Others describe fruit-passing games where Prince Andrew insisted they stand uncomfortably close, pushing boundaries under the guise of entertainment. His infamous mustard trick, where he squeezed mustard onto someone's face while pretending it was an accident, became a ritual he performed repeatedly, each time laughing louder than those around him. Across years and estates, a pattern emerged. Humiliation disguised as humor, intrusion masked as sociability, dominance cloaked in rank. Those who witnessed Prince Andrew's behavior speak of them not as isolated incidents, but as part of an ongoing atmosphere, one in which his royal protection acted as a shield against consequence. Behind the shimmering facade of royal tradition, the stories reveal something much darker. Prince Andrew tested limits, not because he could, but because no one was allowed to say he couldn't. Could his unchecked charm really mask a recklessness that would soon leave a mark far beyond palace walls, challenging patience and expectations within the royal corridors? Prince Andrew. Privilege, power, and public scandal. Even before the world caught a full glimpse of his antics, Andrew had long carried a reputation for reckless charm within palace corridors. The young prince, often celebrated for his status and connections, sometimes let that privilege slide into carelessness, testing the patience of those around him. By 1981, this tendency would not just irritate courtiers, but leave an international mark. That year, Andrew was granted a holiday in Egypt, a lavish gesture of royal esteem. President Anwar Sadat himself offered the use of the presidential jet, a move meant to symbolize the respect between nations and the honor due to the British royal family. It should have been a diplomatic triumph. Yet Andrew's actions soon turned courtesy into calamity. Reports from the trip paint a vivid picture of excess and impropriety. At one glamorous gathering in Cairo, witnesses describe him leaping into a swimming pool fully clothed, pulling along a female guest in a display that stunned the assembled elite. Laughter followed him, but not everyone shared it. The woman emerged embarrassed before the Egyptian high society, while Andrew, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of his conduct, treated the incident as a private joke. It was not just poor taste. It was a misstep on the world stage, a reflection of a prince whose private impulses were already spilling into public shame. Behind closed doors, palace aides often struggled to manage Andrew's behavior. His charm and status provided a shield, making it difficult for even senior courtiers to impose limits. But as his missteps accumulated, it became clear that the prince's recklessness was no longer contained. These moments, whether in high-profile foreign trips or social events closer to home, painted a portrait of someone for whom privilege seemed to excuse consequence. The Cairo incident was far from isolated. Friends, staff, and occasional journalists recount other episodes that blended humor with humiliation, where Andrew's confidence overstepped boundaries. Yet each story reinforced a growing tension. The contrast between the prince's personal sense of entitlement and the responsibilities that came with his royal role. Every laugh he provoked abroad carried the weight of national perception. Diplomats and hosts, expecting decorum befitting a representative of the crown, were often left bewildered or mortified. Andrew's behavior would ripple outward in ways he likely did not foresee. While early incidents were dismissed as youthful indiscretions, the pattern began to chip away at his image. What was initially a private struggle with impulse became a public lesson in the fragile line between charm and impropriety. By the time foreign dignitaries shared their recollections, it was no longer a matter of anecdote but a diplomatic embarrassment, one that would follow him in reporting and rumor for years. The 1981 Egyptian trip, in particular, became emblematic of Andrew's complicated relationship with the world he inhabited. There was wealth, privilege, and access beyond imagination, yet also an absence of restraint that drew attention, often in the wrong way. Laughter at inappropriate moments, pranks that humiliated others, and an apparent disregard for decorum transformed simple holiday stories into cautionary tales. What might have been a routine royal visit became a symbol of unchecked entitlement, an episode that would be remembered not for diplomatic warmth, but for awkward, even shocking moments on the international stage. In reflecting on Andrew's early adult years, a pattern emerges. He was a figure who moved comfortably among power and prestige, but struggled to recognize the weight of his own actions. Each misstep, from playful excess to questionable judgment, revealed a tension at the heart of royal life, the gap between expectation and impulse, responsibility and self-indulgence. And while the palace often smoothed over incidents behind closed doors, the wider world eventually glimpsed what insiders already knew. Andrew's behavior could be both unpredictable and profoundly consequential. The consequences of these moments were more than just social embarrassment. They were reminders of the fragile nature of reputation, the precarious balance between privilege and accountability. In the years following the Egyptian holiday, Andrew's image would oscillate between public fascination and private concern, his actions scrutinized not just as the behavior of a young man, but as the conduct of a prince whose every move reflected upon the monarchy itself. In that, the Cairo pool incident and other episodes served as early warning signs, foreshadowing how a life of extraordinary opportunity could be undermined by lapses in judgment, leaving a legacy both remarkable and controversial. But when those close to Prince Andrew witnessed his true behavior, what shocking impact did it have on the very legacy he hoped to protect? Tales of arrogance and entitlement. The room seemed to shrink whenever Prince Andrew entered, not because of charm or charisma, but because his presence demanded attention simply by virtue of who he was. Those around him quickly learned that manners, respect, or ordinary human decency were optional when dealing with someone whose world revolved entirely around himself. His behavior was consistently dismissive, at times shockingly cruel, and always wrapped in a brazen sense of entitlement that left onlookers uneasy. From casual acquaintances to longtime staff, no one was spared the sting of his arrogance. Even the smallest inconveniences became stages for Prince Andrew's privilege. A wayward golf ball rolling into the back garden would summon police officers to retrieve it, as if the world itself existed solely to serve him. Staff were not colleagues. They were props, expected to anticipate his whims and endure humiliation silently. Social gatherings, dinners, and formal events often turned into uncomfortable exhibitions of power dynamics, where his amusement came at the expense of anyone deemed beneath him. Some incidents became infamous, whispered about in elite circles for decades. In 1992, broadcaster Tanya Breyer endured an episode that would be remembered long after it happened. At a society event, Prince Andrew reportedly walked up behind her and unzipped her dress in public. The stunned silence, awkward laughter, and gasps that followed only seemed to fuel his sense of superiority. It was a moment that revealed a deep disregard not only for personal boundaries, but also for basic decency, leaving witnesses shocked and indignant. This pattern repeated itself in subtler yet equally cutting ways. At a dinner in Windsor Castle, he reportedly mocked an 18-year-old secretary, loudly proclaiming her work uninteresting and unworthy of attention. For those watching, it was a display of power wielded purely for amusement, a stark reminder that in Prince Andrew's presence respect was not earned through effort or merit, but merely by fitting into his narrow definitions of worth. Friends and insiders described sitting beside him as a trial of endurance, where conversation often devolved into commentary about women's clothing or other trivial private matters, reducing those around him to objects for his entertainment. Observers noted that Prince Andrew's behavior was not impulsive or occasional, it was habitual. Privilege, it seemed, was not simply a circumstance of birth, but a lens through which he interpreted every interaction. It shaped how he navigated events, engaged with colleagues, and measured amusement. Laughter in the room frequently came at the cost of someone else's dignity, a cruel calculus where the powerful were entertained and the powerless were humiliated. Yet beneath the layers of arrogance, there lingered a constant obsession with appearances, status, and social rank. Every encounter became an opportunity for Prince Andrew to assert superiority, to remind those present of his elevated station. Women, in particular, often drew his attention in ways that were intrusive and objectifying, and he rarely faced immediate consequences for such behavior. It was as if the weight of privilege could shield even the most indefensible acts from scrutiny, leaving a trail of discomfort, anger, and whispered stories in its wake. Through all this, a clear pattern emerges: entitlement, exercised without restraint, amusement derived from others' misfortune, and a persistent insistence on being the center of attention. Incidents like those with Tanya Breyer and the young secretary at Windsor Castle were not isolated lapses, but symptomatic of a broader worldview, one in which rules, manners, and empathy applied unevenly, if at all. The shock and indignation these actions provoked lingered far longer than the laughter they briefly inspired, leaving many to wonder how such behavior could be tolerated, excused, or even normalized within elite circles. Ultimately, the portrait that emerges is one of a man defined as much by arrogance as by privilege. From trivial demands to moments of outright cruelty, the pattern is unmistakable. Prince Andrew was accustomed to getting his way, for whom boundaries, empathy, and discretion were inconveniences rather than guiding principles. In recounting these episodes, it becomes clear that the spectacle of entitlement left lasting impressions not merely because of what he did, but because of the culture of acquiescence that allowed it, and the people who endured it, often in silence, as the world watched on. Even now, decades later, these stories continue to surface, whispered among social circles or recounted in memoirs, a reminder that the shadow of privilege can stretch far beyond the walls of palaces and private estates. For those who encountered Prince Andrew, the memory is often uncomfortable, sometimes infuriating, but always indelible, a testament to the power dynamics and unchecked entitlement that shaped both his life and the lives of those around him. So how did unchecked entitlement allow Prince Andrew to navigate power with impunity, affecting everyone in his orbit in ways few could have imagined? When entitlement meets consequence. For decades, Prince Andrew moved through the corridors of power with a sense of untouchable freedom, a world where privilege masked behavior that would have unsettled any ordinary person. Those around him, staff, acquaintances, and the young women drawn into his orbit, quickly learned that his charm could turn cruel, and his jokes were rarely harmless. They were sharp, deliberate, and humiliating. Observers, like author Andrew Looney, described his antics not as the harmless eccentricities of royalty, but as calculated acts meant to provoke and dominate, a blend of juvenile mischief and entitlement. It wasn't mischief, it was a weapon. Accounts paint a portrait of a man accustomed to having the world bend around him, a man emboldened by the protective walls of the monarchy. Complaints were dismissed or quietly silenced, creating a long pattern of behavior that, for decades, seemed untouchable. Staff feared reprisal, witnesses were ignored, and the illusions of consequence did not exist. This was a world where power shielded wrongdoing, where audacity thrived under the veneer of aristocracy. Jeffrey Epstein, whose name would forever be entwined with scandal, once referred to Andrew as more perverted than I am, dubbing him the King of Kink, a description that shocked some and confirmed the darkest suspicions of others. Yet for all his audacity, the protective bubble surrounding Andrew was fragile, and cracks were forming. November 6th, a date that will remain etched in modern royal history, marked a turning point. King Charles, with decisive authority, stripped Andrew of all his military affiliations and royal patronages. The gesture wasn't symbolic alone. It was a formal acknowledgement that decades of privilege could no longer shield misconduct. It was a public reckoning, a declaration that entitlement has its limits, and that the walls of royalty could not contain every misdeed. The revelations themselves are staggering. Stories recounting Andrew's treatment of staff and young women reveal a consistent pattern: humiliation as entertainment, exploitation as routine, a hierarchy where his whims superseded ethics. Many of those who observed his behavior in private settings noted a disturbing casualness in how he wielded power. What might appear on the surface as eccentric or awkward often had a sinister undertone. Staff members were caught between fear and loyalty. Witnesses who might have spoken up were met with an impenetrable web of intimidation and social consequence. Every ignored complaint, every brushed-off allegation, reinforced his belief that he was untouchable. The public, now seeing the culmination of years of quiet whispers and half-heard rumors, is left grappling with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. How could a member of one of the most scrutinized families in history operate for so long with apparent impunity? The truth lies partly in the systemic protections that surrounded him, the monarchy's inclination to preserve reputation over accountability. The palace, in effect, created an environment where arrogance and entitlement were tolerated and, at times, nurtured. The long-standing shield around Andrew allowed him to humiliate, intimidate, and exploit, safe in the belief that consequences were a distant abstraction. Yet November 6th shattered that illusion. The stripping of titles was not merely punitive, it was emblematic. It communicated that history would not remain silent, that documentation and testimony could outweigh privilege. And while Andrew's actions had been recorded, reported, and sometimes whispered about in hushed tones across decades, the palace's inaction had enabled the continuation of those behaviors. The world could finally see that what appeared as arrogance or eccentricity was, in fact, a deeply rooted pattern of entitlement with real-world consequences for those in his orbit. The broader implications are profound. Questions linger about why more witnesses did not step forward sooner, and why the mechanisms designed to protect the vulnerable were so slow to act. Every account of Andrew's misconduct, every humiliation inflicted in private quarters, suggests an almost systemic failure, a combination of fear, power, and the weight of centuries-old traditions. Yet the public reckoning now forces reflection. The walls of privilege can crumble, and even centuries-old institutions are not immune to scrutiny. In the end, Andrew's story is not just a chronicle of one man's excesses, but a cautionary tale about unchecked power. Entitlement, no matter how gilded, cannot remain invisible forever. The humiliations, the silenced complaints, the carefully maintained illusion of untouchability, all converged into a moment when consequence finally arrived. And while some may still wonder what might have been prevented had action come sooner, the stripping of titles on November 6th marks a definitive statement. Privilege does not excuse cruelty, and history remembers. Now the question looms over the future. Will others step forward, emboldened by this moment, or will silence continue to shield the powerful? The narrative of Andrew's entitlement is a stark reminder that even the most protected lives are subject to the reckoning of time, truth, and public scrutiny. In the modern era, power may shield for a while, but consequences, once set in motion, can be unstoppable. So, what do you think made Andrew believe he could humiliate and control everyone at his parties for decades? We'd like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like and share.